In the powerful tradition of emotional family dramas and quiet historical fiction, this story follows Constance Whitmore, a 68-year-old grandmother who discovers her beloved daughter Rose has been quietly chosen for a generations-old family tradition called the arrangement. If you want to know what this tradition was, keep watching this real story and comment below if you know a family still have such tradition. Constance Whitmore stopped at the portrait on the staircase the way some people paused at church altars. The house was still asleep around her. 4:43 in the morning. The long corridors held the dense quiet of old wealth, a silence layered over decades until it acquired a texture of its own. Heavy runners softened footsteps on polished wood. The grandfather clock in the lower hall ticked with discreet authority. Somewhere deep in the walls, old pipes sighed once and settled. Constance stood halfway up the staircase, with one hand resting lightly against the banister, worn smooth by a century of Whitmore palms. The portrait watched her from its accustomed place. A young woman in muted blue, early 1940s perhaps, pleasant face, narrow shoulders, hands folded neatly in her lap as though even in oil she had been instructed to take up as little space as possible. Nothing dramatic in the expression, no sorrow anyone could point to directly, only a carefulness so complete it had replaced personality altogether. 45 years Constance had passed that portrait, 45 years stopping for half a second longer than necessary. At first because she had been new to the family and eager to memorize its history, later because she had learned the woman's name, Margaret, and later still because the longer she looked at Margaret, the more the face ceased to belong to one woman at all. It became Vera's face at 30, Vera's face at 50, Vera's face at 70. That same careful pleasantness, that same gradual retreat of something essential behind good manners and usefulness and years spent making herself indispensable to people who never once asked what she herself might have become. Constance descended the remaining stairs slowly, her robe tied tightly against the dawn chill. In the breakfast room, the curtains remained half drawn, allowing only a thin gray wash of morning into the room. She lit the small lamp beside the sideboard rather than the overhead fixture. The house preferred restraint even in illumination. The kettle began its quiet rumble. Outside the windows, the garden waited beneath a pale veil of mist. Constance could already smell the roses through the slight cracks she had left open overnight. Damp earth, green stems, early summer preparing itself carefully. She poured tea into thin white china and sat at the long breakfast table alone. The tea cooled untouched between her hands. The arrangement had never been written down under that name, not formally. No documents existed declaring it. No family records announced it proudly beside births and marriages and property transfers. It survived the way many old cruelties survived, through repetition softened by good intentions. A practical solution dressed as devotion. 3 generations earlier, a Whitmore daughter named Eleanor had remained unmarried to care for aging parents and an invalid brother. After her death, the family praised her sacrifice so lavishly that it hardened into expectation. By the next generation, it had become structure. By the third, tradition. One daughter chosen young, usually the quietest, usually the one most eager to please, the one least likely to imagine escape before the walls closed gently around her. She would remain with the family always. She would move where needed. A widowed aunt in Surrey, an aging grandfather in Bath, a cousin recovering from surgery, a household between governesses, a nursery needing supervision, a sick room requiring patience. Useful everywhere, necessary nowhere. In return, she would be provided for her entire life. Trust income, beautiful rooms that never quite belonged to her, fine clothing selected by other women, gratitude expressed warmly over holiday tables. And when she died, everything returned neatly to the estate. The money circled home. The daughter never did. Constance had met Vera Whitmore 2 weeks after marrying Edward. Vera had been 31 then, capable, attentive, gentle in the way people become gentle when they have learned resistance changes nothing except how lonely they feel afterward. Constance remembered watching Vera move through a dinner party carrying coffee cups with perfect composure while conversations unfolded around her that never included her directly. Vera laughed when appropriate, anticipated needs before requests were spoken, refilled glasses, located misplaced spectacles, smoothed discomfort from rooms the way practiced hands smoothed linen wrinkles. Everyone adored Vera. No one saw her. At 22, Constance had not understood what she was looking at yet. She came from ordinary school teachers in Sussex. Her mother balanced grocery lists against heating bills every winter. Her father repaired his own shoes until the soles surrendered entirely. In her family, usefulness belonged to everyone equally. Care moved in all directions. The Whitmores had seemed dazzling then. The silver, the certainty, the effortless confidence of people raised never to question whether space belonged to them. And Constance, clever enough to survive any room she entered, had learned quickly. She mastered their rhythms, their preferences, their codes of silence. She became the ideal Whitmore wife with such flawless precision that eventually even the Whitmores forgot she had not been born one of them. But she never entirely forgot herself. That had been the mistake. Or perhaps the salvation. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked faintly. Someone waking? Constance lifted her tea finally and discovered it had already gone cold. Today, Uncle Charles would arrive from Hampshire. Today, the family council would quietly begin moving toward its next decision. Rose had been selected. Not formally. Not aloud. The Whitmores disliked vulgar explicitness. But for nearly 2 years, Constance had watched the subtle narrowing begin around her third daughter. Invitations directed differently. Questions asked with particular interest. Long approving glances exchanged between older relatives whenever Rose sat quietly reading, while louder cousins chased attention across rooms. Suitable, those glances said. Steady, adaptable, kind. Rose herself noticed none of it. Or rather, she noticed it and interpreted it innocently because why would she not? She believed herself loved. She was loved. That was the terrible part of systems like this. The affection inside them was often genuine. Vera had been genuinely loved too. Constance closed her eyes briefly. 2 years earlier, she had sat beside Vera's bed during the final week of her life. The room smelled faintly medicinal beneath lavender polish. Rain tapped softly against windows while the old woman slept and woke and slept again. At 79, Vera had become nearly weightless beneath blankets. Constance remembered holding her hand. Papery skin, warm still. Vera opened her eyes sometime after midnight and looked at Constance with an expression unlike any she had worn during life. Not pleasant, not careful, simply tired. I had a dream once, Constance. Constance leaned closer to hear. When I was young. Before. The rain against glass. The slow tick of the bedside clock. I was going to be a teacher. Did you know that? I was going to be a teacher. Then Vera closed her eyes again. And something inside Constance, carefully obedient for 43 years by then, shifted permanently out of place. A door upstairs opened. Soft footsteps crossed the landing overhead. The house was waking now. Constance rose from the table and carried her untouched tea to the sink. Through the window, the roses glistened silver with dew. Today Charles would arrive, smiling and generous and entirely certain. Today Edward would expect agreement, because agreement had always been what happened. Today the machinery would move toward Rose. And Constance, who had been awake since 3 a.m. listening to the silence of the house press around her chest, had already made her own decision. No, The word settled inside her with astonishing calm. Not Rose. Not any daughter of hers. The arrangement would reach its limit here, in this house, at her hands. By 8:30, the Whitmore home had fully assembled itself into morning elegance. Staff moved quietly through corridors, carrying trays and fresh flowers. Sunlight reached across polished floors in long, pale bands. Somewhere beyond the library, Edward spoke on the telephone in the measured, reassuring tone he used for business matters and family matters alike, because to Edward those categories had always overlapped naturally. Constance stood in the garden, clipping dead heads from the climbing roses, when she heard the familiar sound of Charles Whitmore's car rolling over gravel. She did not turn immediately. Birdsong threaded through the hedges. The scent of earth rose damp and rich beneath the warming day. Her gloves were streaked green at the fingertips. "Constance," Charles called warmly a moment later. "Still rescuing these roses from neglect, I see." She turned then with the exact smile expected of her. "Someone must." Charles crossed the garden path toward her with open arms and immaculate tailoring. At 74, he retained the broad, easy charm that had carried him successfully through boardrooms and funerals and uncomfortable conversations for decades. He kissed her cheek affectionately. No performance in it. That was the difficulty. Charles truly believed himself kind. "Beautiful morning," he said, looking around. "You always did make this place softer somehow." Constance handed pruning shears to the gardener, approaching discreetly from the far hedge. "And you always did arrive just before lunch." Charles laughed. Inside the house, Rose appeared at the top of the terrace steps, carrying a book tucked against her side. 24 years old, dark hair pinned carelessly back, cream sweater sleeves pushed to her elbows, despite the lingering coolness. Charles's face altered almost imperceptibly when he saw her. Approval entered it. Recognition. Possession so subtle another person might have mistaken it for fondness. "Rose, my dear." Rose smiled with quiet sincerity and descended the steps. "Uncle Charles, how was the drive?" Endlessly dull until the final 20 minutes. Nothing worth seeing between Berkshire and civilization. Rose laughed softly. Not loud like Diana's laugh. Rose's amusement always arrived as though shared privately with herself first. Constance watched Charles, watching her daughter. The measured attentiveness, the satisfaction. Rose noticed the attention, as she always had throughout her life, and filed it automatically under affection. Why wouldn't she? Charles had brought her books every birthday since she was 12, remembered details about her university courses, asked thoughtful questions about what she read. Unlike louder relatives, he listened when she answered. Predators rarely resembled monsters in families like this. They resembled guardians. Diana emerged onto the terrace next with her husband Michael beside her. Her eyes moved once from Charles to Rose and away again quickly. A small motion. Practiced. Then Diana's hand found Michael's arm unconsciously. Constance saw that too. Diana knew fragments. Not enough, but enough. By lunch, the dining room glowed with polished silver and restrained conversation. White peonies stood heavy in crystal vases down the center of the table. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, softening everyone's edges. Edward presided comfortably at one end, Constance at the other. Family spread between them in familiar configurations. Charles recounting some story from London, Helena laughing with careful elegance, Edmund discussing estate taxes with board expertise, Rose listening more than speaking, Diana watching everyone at once. Warmth moved around the table genuinely. That mattered. They were not villains gathered in secret conspiracy. They were people raised inside architecture so old they mistook its walls for the natural shape of love. Constance buttered bread while Charles asked Rose about Thomas. The question arrived casually. "And this young teacher of yours, Still keeping the local grammar school from collapse entirely? Rose smiled faintly. They're managing without catastrophe so far. A school teacher? Edmund lifted an eyebrow with amused tolerance. God bless the profession. Impossible work for impossible pay. Rose's expression cooled slightly. Constance noticed Thomas had that effect on the family. Not hatred exactly, merely incomprehension. Why would a Whitmore daughter attach herself seriously to someone so ordinary? Thomas rented a small flat above a pharmacy. His father repaired boilers. His mother volunteered at the library twice weekly, and still sent him home with leftovers in mismatched containers. The Whitmores found this background vaguely alarming. Constance found it restful. Charles leaned toward Rose kindly. "And are you happy, my dear?" Rose glanced up with mild surprise at the directness of the question. "Yes," she said simply, "I am." Something tightened behind Helena's smile. Lunch continued. The servants cleared plates. Coffee arrived. Outside the windows, bees drifted lazily through lavender borders. And beneath the entire lovely civilized meal ran another conversation entirely, invisible but present as underground water. Constance felt it in pauses, in glances, in the slight concentration with which Charles observed Rose whenever she was not looking. After coffee, Edward rose when Charles touched his sleeve lightly. "Walk with me a moment?" "Of course." The two men disappeared through the terrace doors into the garden. Constance watched them from her chair. She could not hear their voices once they reached the lower path near the hedges. She knew every word anyway. Rose is ready. Quiet enough. Steady enough. No dangerous ambitions. Attached to this Thomas fellow perhaps, but that can be redirected with time and tact. The arrangement passes properly now. The family continues. 50 years earlier, almost those exact sentences had been spoken about Vera in this same garden while she arranged flowers inside, believing herself simply useful and beloved. Constance folded her napkin carefully beside her untouched coffee. Across the table, Diana met her eyes briefly. Fear flickered there. Edward returned 20 minutes later alone. His expression had settled into certainty, not excitement, not triumph, merely the composed confidence of a man confirming something he had always assumed inevitable. "Constance," he said quietly from the doorway. "A word." She rose without hurry and followed him into the morning room overlooking the east lawn. Edward closed the door gently behind them. Outside the window, sunlight struck the fountain basin into fractured brightness. Somewhere upstairs, Rose laughed at something Diana said. Light, alive. Edward rested one hand against the mantel. "Charles thinks Rose is ready." Constance looked toward the garden instead of at her husband. "Ready for what?" A pause. Very slight. "The arrangement, Constance." The word entered the room with almost ceremonial weight. "It passes to our generation now. Charles believes it's time we begin discussing transitions." Constance stared at the roses beyond the glass. 45 years she had tended them, pruned carefully, fed roots deeply, protected fragile new growth against frost. Behind her, Edward continued gently, reasonable as ever. "Rose is ideally suited in many ways. Thoughtful, calm. She's always been happiest close to home. And of course she would be entirely provided for." "No." Edward stopped speaking. Constance turned then. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no, Edward." Not loud. She had never needed loudness. In 45 years of marriage, Edward had seen his wife angry perhaps 3 times, seen her disappointed more often, seen her amused, elegant, endlessly capable. He had never seen this. The absolute stillness in her face unsettled him first. "Constance," he began carefully, "perhaps we should discuss this more rationally." Not Rose. Something in her voice caused him to fall silent. "Not any of our daughters. Edward blinked once, as though the sentence itself failed to arrange properly in his understanding. This is tradition. This is ownership. His expression hardened slightly. That is unfair. No. Unfair was Vera dying in a room that never belonged to her after spending 79 years belonging to everyone else. Edward exhaled slowly. You know that isn't how anyone viewed Vera. Constance looked at him steadily. That was the problem. The grandfather clock downstairs marked the quarter hour. Edward rubbed a hand once across his mouth. Constance, please be reasonable. Rose would be cherished. She would never want for anything. Constance stepped closer. Rose will marry if she wishes to marry. Rose will have children if she wishes for children. Rose will wake up one morning at 79 and recognize her own life when she looks back at it. Her voice remained perfectly level. That is what I am providing. Edward stared at her as though some hidden door in the house had opened unexpectedly onto unfamiliar land. This isn't only your decision. Constance held his gaze. Watch me make it anyway. The days afterward unfolded with the quiet pressure of weather systems moving across old ground. Nothing exploded. No one shouted. If you like this video, hit like button and subscribe our channel so you can watch all new stories. The Whitmores considered shouting vulgar. Instead, the pressure arrived through conversations arranged carefully at advantageous hours, through visits framed as concern, through the heavy disappointment of people who believed themselves reasonable confronting someone who refused reason as they understood it. Charles came first. Of course. He arrived 3 mornings later carrying apricot preserves from Hampshire, and concern folded neatly beneath courtesy. Constance received him in the garden room where afternoon light filtered pale gold through the windows. Vera's portrait still hung upstairs then. Constance could feel it above them like another listener. Charles stirred sugar into tea he never drank. I think perhaps Edward misunderstood the severity of your objection. He understood perfectly. Charles sighed softly. Constance, you've been part of this family nearly half a century. You know what the arrangement truly is. Do I? A provision, a continuity, a structure ensuring no daughter is ever abandoned or financially vulnerable. Constance watched sunlight move slowly across the carpet. And in exchange? Charles frowned faintly. Exchange implies transaction, doesn't it? He leaned forward then, patient as though explaining difficult arithmetic to a gifted but emotional child. Families survive because individuals occasionally accept responsibility beyond themselves. Vera understood that. Constance looked at him quietly. Did she? Charles hesitated. It was the first crack. Tiny, but real. Vera was deeply valued. That wasn't my question. Silence gathered between them. At last, Charles set down his cup carefully. You are allowing sentiment to distort something fundamentally honorable. Constance almost smiled. The Whitmores loved honor. The word allowed almost any cruelty once polished sufficiently. What exactly was honorable, she asked gently, about selecting the least resistant daughter and folding her life inward until she no longer expected one of her own? Charles's expression sharpened. That is an ugly interpretation. It is an accurate one. He rose then, moving toward the windows with controlled irritation. Outside the roses climbed their trellises in disciplined abundance. You know what happens to families without continuity, he said. Everything fractures eventually. Property, loyalty, obligation. Constance remained seated. And perhaps some things should fracture. Charles turned back toward her. For a moment, age showed clearly in him. Weariness beneath authority. A man carrying structures older than himself because he had inherited them and never imagined setting them down. You would dismantle generations over one modern impulse toward self-definition. Constance thought suddenly of Vera at 20, perhaps, young enough still to dream of classrooms. One modern impulse. "No," she said quietly. "I would dismantle generations because one woman told me what it cost her to survive them." Charles left an hour later more disappointed than angry. Disappointment was harder to withstand somehow. Helena came next. Helena, who had spent 50 years being grateful. They sat together beneath the pergola while rain softened the garden into silver blur beyond the vines. Helena's hands trembled slightly around her teacup, though her pearls remained perfectly aligned at her throat. "I almost made the same mistake you're making now," she said. Constance waited. "I nearly objected when they selected Vera. We were girls still. I thought it cruel at first. Unfair. And then?" Helena's eyes moved toward the rain. "And then I watched her life become meaningful." Constance said nothing. "She was needed everywhere," Helena continued softly. "Everyone depended on her. She mattered enormously to this family." Constance studied her sister-in-law carefully. Helena truly believed this, or had believed it so long the belief itself had become survival. "Did you ask Vera if it made her happy?" Helena looked startled. "What? Did you ever ask her?" The rain tapped steadily overhead. Helena lowered her eyes. "No." "Why not?" A long silence followed. At last Helena whispered, "I think perhaps I didn't want the answer." There it was. Not cruelty. Cowardice braided tightly with relief. Helena had escaped selection herself. Her marriage to a banker in Kent had secured ordinary freedom early, and every year afterward she had needed Vera's sacrifice to remain noble because otherwise Helena had simply walked away while her sister disappeared. Systems survived partly because they redistributed guilt. Edmund approached matters financially. Of course he did. He arrived with folders, charts, trust structures, tax implications spoken in brisk, practical language across Edward's study, while brandy glowed amber in crystal beside his elbow. "The existing estate architecture depends upon certain assumptions," he explained. "You cannot simply remove an entire mechanism without consequences." Constance sat opposite him, perfectly composed. "Watch me?" Edmund blinked. "The trusts cycle efficiently because assets return centrally rather than fragmenting outward through marriages and independent inheritance lines." "How tragic for the accountants." He frowned. "This isn't emotional, Constance." "No," she agreed. "That is exactly the problem." Edward suffered worst perhaps because he genuinely loved his wife, while remaining unable entirely to see what she saw. At night he lay awake beside her longer than usual. His breathing remained uneven in the dark. One evening, while Constance folded laundry in their sitting room, he spoke suddenly from his chair near the fire. "There must be compromise somewhere." She continued folding one of his shirts carefully. "Between what and what?" "Between tradition and," he gestured vaguely, "whatever it is you believe will happen instead." Constance set the shirt aside. "You mean Rose having an actual life?" Edward rubbed his forehead tiredly. "You make it sound monstrous." She looked at him then with more sadness than anger. "Edward, tell me honestly, if you had been born female in this family, quiet and compliant and useful, would you have accepted this future for yourself?" He opened his mouth, closed it again, because for perhaps the first time in 71 years he was attempting sincerely to imagine the question rather than defend the answer. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "No," Constance said softly. "You don't." The pressure continued. Meals acquired undertones. Phone calls lengthened awkwardly. Rose sensed tension without context. Diana watched everyone nervously. Charles grew cooler, Helena quieter. And through all of it, Constance held, not because she felt no fear, because she did. Late at night, she walked the garden paths alone beneath moonlight, silvering the hedges. The house loomed behind her, immense and watchful. 3 generations of expectation pressed invisibly at her back. Some nights doubt touched her briefly. Not doubt about the decision. Never that. Doubt about whether one woman could actually withstand an architecture this old. Whether refusal mattered once systems had rooted themselves into bloodlines and habits and inheritances. Then Vera's voice returned. I was going to be a teacher. Constance would stop walking. The night air cool against her face, roses breathing sweetness around her. A teacher. Such an ordinary dream. Not glory, not rebellion. A classroom, children, chalk dust perhaps, papers to grade beside a lamp at night. A life small enough millions lived it, without ceremony. And Vera had been denied even that. Constance stood beneath the climbing roses one midnight, while the house slept, and understood something with terrible clarity. The Whitmores had never believed they were taking lives, only redirecting them. That was why the system endured so elegantly. No chains, no prison doors. Only affection narrowing gradually into expectation until the chosen daughter could no longer remember where her own desires had originally ended. Constance straightened slowly beneath the moonlight. Then she went inside, made herself tea, and did not waver. The first thing Constance did was find a solicitor who had never heard the name Whitmore spoken with reverence. His office occupied the second floor above a bakery in Chichester. The carpet smelled faintly of dust and old paper. The receptionist wore bright green nail polish that would have caused quiet cardiac distress among Edward's relatives. Constance liked her immediately. Mr. Alan Pierce himself was 60 perhaps, round glasses, practical tie, no instinct whatsoever to defer automatically to inherited wealth. He listened without interruption while Constance explained what she required. Not everything. Never the full history. Only enough. When she finished, he removed his glasses thoughtfully. So you wish to create independent protections for your daughters that cannot later be absorbed back into family holdings. Yes. And these protections need to remain inaccessible to existing Whitmore estate structures. Entirely. He nodded slowly. Your husband aware of this consultation? No. No shame in the answer. Only fact. Mr. Pierce studied her a moment longer. Mrs. Whitmore, forgive my directness, but families with this degree of generational wealth often employ considerable pressure when financial traditions are interrupted. Constance folded her gloves neatly in her lap. That is why I came to someone outside the family. Something almost like admiration crossed his face briefly. Over the following weeks, Constance constructed quietly. Funds transferred. Properties separated legally. Inheritance channels rerouted beyond Whitmore control. Documents drafted with the calm precision of a woman who understood that love, unsupported by structure, remained vulnerable to revision after funerals. Her parents had taught her that much long before she entered rooms with silver place cards. People die, paper survives. By the third meeting, Mr. Pierce no longer asked unnecessary questions. He simply worked carefully. You realize, he said once while reviewing final documents, that someone has anticipated this possibility before. Some of these protections already exist partially in older legislation regarding coercive inheritance structures. Constance looked up. Meaning? Meaning systems like the one you're describing have existed in different forms elsewhere? Of course they had. No cruelty invented itself only once. When the documents were complete, Constance placed her signature beneath the final page with steady hands. There, not victory, but foundation. The second thing she did was invite Thomas Ashford to tea. Rose believed her mother merely curious about the young man she loved, which was true, But curiosity was only the surface layer of what brought Constance to that decision. She needed to know whether Thomas possessed the rarest quality in certain men, the ability to perceive a quiet woman fully before the world taught him not to bother. Thomas arrived on a windy Thursday carrying flowers clearly purchased with sincere uncertainty. Freesias, slightly lopsided arrangement. Constance accepted them with warmth that eased his shoulders marginally. "Thank you. Come into the garden room. Rose is spending the afternoon with Diana." A flicker of disappointment crossed his face before he hid it politely. Good, Constance thought. The tea service gleamed between them while rain clouds gathered beyond the windows. Thomas sat carefully upright on the edge of the sofa like a man aware he had entered territory far grander than his upbringing equipped him to navigate comfortably. Constance poured tea. "You teach literature?" "History mostly, some English." "And you enjoy it?" A surprised smile touched his face. "Very much." Not ambition then, not performance, simply truth. They spoke for nearly an hour. About classrooms, books. Rose always eventually rose. Thomas described her the way attentive people describe whether they have learned intimately. Not dramatically, accurately. "She notices things nobody else seems to," he said once. "Small things. If someone's uncomfortable in a room, or lonely, she'll change the conversation slightly, and suddenly everyone's breathing easier." Constance stirred sugar slowly into her tea, though she took none. "Yes," she said, "she's always done that." Thomas smiled faintly. "I don't think people realize how intelligent she is because she doesn't compete for attention." There it was. Seeing, noticing the distinction between quietness and absence. Many people confuse the two deliberately because it benefited them. Constance asked lightly, "And does her family's opinion of you trouble you?" Thomas met her eyes directly then. "Sometimes? Why?" "Because Rose loves them." Not because he wanted their approval. Because Rose did. Another point in his favor. At last Constance set down her cup. "Rose doesn't know I've spoken to you today. She won't know." Thomas nodded uncertainly. "I wanted only to tell you one thing." He waited. "She is remarkable." Simple words, but something in her tone caused him to straighten unconsciously. "And she has spent her whole life in a house that almost didn't see that?" Confusion flickered across his face briefly. Constance continued before questions could form. "Don't make the same mistake." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. He did not fully understand. How could he? But understanding enough passed quietly between them anyway. "I don't intend to," he said. Constance poured more tea. "Good. Then we understand each other." After he left, she stood at the window watching him walk down the drive beneath gathering rain. Ordinary coat. Sensible shoes. No Whitmore polish whatsoever. Thank God. The third thing Constance did was tell Diana the truth. Not fragments. Not suggestions. Everything. They sat together late one evening in Constance's bedroom while the rest of the house slept. Vera's portrait still watched from the staircase beyond the door. Rain moved softly against windows. Diana listened without interrupting as her mother's voice carried steadily through 3 generations of women disappearing politely into usefulness. Margaret. Vera, the unnamed others before them. The selection process. The trusts. The return of inheritance at death. The careful shaping of entire lives until service replaced selfhood so completely nobody remembered the difference. By the time Constance finished, Diana had gone utterly pale. "Oh my God." Constance folded her hands together tightly once to stop their trembling. "Yes." Diana stood abruptly and crossed toward the window. "I knew something existed. I knew there were expectations around Vera, but I thought..." She stopped helplessly. "I don't know what I thought." "You thought what everyone thought. That it was normal because everyone around you behaved as though it were." Diana turned back slowly. And Rose knows nothing. How close was she? Constance looked at her eldest daughter for a long moment. Close enough. Diana covered her mouth with one hand. Relief moved through her face first. Immediate. Instinctive. Thank God it wasn't me. Then shame followed so quickly it almost looked like pain. Oh God, she whispered. I was relieved all these years. I knew they watched her differently, and I was relieved. Constance crossed the room then and took Diana's hand gently. That is how systems survive, by making escape feel like virtue. Tears gathered suddenly in Diana's eyes. What happens if Rose finds out someday? She must not. Diana stared at her. Mother? No. Constance's voice sharpened with rare force. Rose's life should feel like simply her life unfolding naturally, not like something she was rescued from. I will not place that burden inside her happiness. Diana sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, and if she asks questions, she won't, because nothing will happen. Constance sat beside her daughter. I am making sure nothing happens. The words settled heavily between them. Not heroism. Administration. Protection so complete it erased evidence of danger itself. Diana leaned against her mother's shoulder suddenly like a child again. Constance wrapped an arm around her quietly. For several minutes neither spoke. Beyond the bedroom door, the great house remained silent around them, full of portraits, full of ghosts, full of women whose names survived while their actual selves had vanished almost entirely. Constance held her daughter and understood with painful clarity that she could save only those still ahead of her. The others remained unreachable. That was the grief beneath every victory in this story. The formal family gathering took place on a Sunday afternoon beneath skies threatening rain but withholding it stubbornly. The Whitmores preferred difficult weather to remain dignified. Constance dressed carefully in dark green silk and pearls Edward had given her 30 years earlier, armor disguised as elegance. She pinned her hair precisely, applied lipstick with steady hands. Edward watched her from the doorway of their bedroom. You don't need to make this adversarial. Constance met his eyes in the mirror. I assure you, Edward, I understand exactly what this is. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because somewhere during the past weeks, his certainty had begun slipping fractionally out of reach, not enough to abandon the tradition, not enough even to condemn it fully, but enough to feel unsettled standing near his wife now. The meeting convened in the good room. Of course it did. Tall windows, pale carpets, oil portraits observing from gilded frames, the good china arranged with ceremonial precision atop low tables. Everything civilized enough to disguise the fact that generations of life-altering decisions had occurred in this room without the subjects themselves present. Rose believed the gathering merely another family consultation regarding estate matters. She and Thomas had gone walking in town that afternoon. Constance had ensured it. Charles sat near the fireplace with papers arranged neatly beside him, though everyone already knew the contents. Helena occupied the sofa nearest the windows. Edmund poured himself sherry immediately upon arrival. Edward stood for several minutes before finally taking the chair beside Constance rather than across from her. Interesting. The room smelled faintly of furniture polish and lilies. Charles began formally. We're gathered because certain long-standing family structures require clarification. Constance almost smiled. The Whitmore genius for euphemism remained unmatched. Charles continued speaking in measured tones about continuity, stability, provision, responsibility across generations. His voice carried genuine conviction that mattered too. He believed himself protector rather than oppressor. Perhaps that was what made him dangerous. Helena followed. More emotional? She spoke of Vera with visible tenderness, Vera's usefulness, Vera's devotion, the comfort she brought every household she entered. She was loved deeply, Helena said softly. People depended on her. Constance watched Helena's hands twisting together in her lap. Guilt lived there now, beneath the defense. Good? Not because guilt solved anything, because truth had finally entered the room. Edmund approached matters predictably through figures and consequences. The estate structure cannot sustain indefinite fragmentation, he explained. The arrangement was created partly to prevent exactly the sort of financial dissolution affecting most old families now. Constance wondered briefly whether he heard himself. Most old families now. As though women existed chiefly to stabilize property lines. Edward spoke least. He sat beside Constance almost unnaturally still, while others built the case surrounding him. Once or twice she felt him glance toward her, but she did not return the look. At last Charles folded his hands. Constance, we understand your concerns, truly. But perhaps now that everyone has spoken calmly, we might arrive at a more balanced perspective. Balanced? Constance rested her teacup carefully onto its saucer. The small click echoed softly through the room. Then she began. She never raised her voice. No one listening afterward could later identify exactly when the atmosphere shifted, only that somehow the room they had occupied comfortably for decades became unfamiliar ground beneath them. Constance spoke first about arriving as a young bride, about learning Whitmore customs, about Vera, not abstractly, specifically, the way Vera anticipated everyone's needs before they themselves recognized them, the way conversations drifted around her rather than toward her, the way she packed and unpacked entire lives into spare rooms across 40 years without complaint. Charles interrupted once. Vera accepted her role willingly. Constance looked at him steadily. Did she? Silence. Then Constance continued. She spoke about systems that survived precisely because no single participant felt cruel inside them, about affection used unintentionally as restraint, about usefulness mistaken for fulfillment because confronting the alternative required unbearable honesty. Helena's hands stopped moving eventually. Edmund ceased reaching for his notes. Edward watched his wife with an expression approaching bewilderment, as though he were discovering hidden rooms inside someone he had loved half a century. Then Constance spoke about Vera's final week, the rain against windows, the smell of lavender, Vera's hand warm and papery inside hers. I had a dream once, Constance. Constance repeated the words quietly into the room. When I was young. Before? Helena lowered her head sharply. I was going to be a teacher. Did you know that? I was going to be a teacher. No one moved. Outside, thunder murmured distantly across the countryside. Constance turned toward Helena directly. Did you know Vera wanted to teach? Helena looked stricken. She never said. She told me. Constance's voice remained gentle. That gentleness made it worse somehow. In her last days, when she finally had nothing left to lose by wanting something, Helena pressed trembling fingers briefly against her mouth. The room changed then, not dramatically. No revelation thundered down, but for the first time the arrangement encountered not theory but cost. Actual human cost attached to an actual woman they had all loved while failing to ask who she might have been outside their need. Charles recovered first. One regret at the end of life does not invalidate generations of stability. Constance looked at him sadly. Do you hear yourself? His jaw tightened. You are allowing sentiment to destroy structure. No, she said. I am allowing structure to encounter reality. Then she reached beside her chair and placed a folder onto the low table between them. Mr. Pierce's documents, neatly organized, legally devastating. Edmund frowned, immediately reaching for them, while Charles stiffened visibly. What is this? My daughter's futures. Edmund opened the folder. The silence lengthened as he scanned pages. Then another, then another. His face altered gradually from irritation to alarm. Constance, he said carefully, these provisions separate substantial assets permanently from Whitmore estate return channels. Yes. Charles leaned forward sharply. You've already executed these? Yes. Without consultation? Constance met his gaze calmly. I was not requesting permission. Edmund flipped another page faster now. These trusts cannot be absorbed later through marital consolidation either. No. Charles stood abruptly, moving toward the windows as though physical motion might restore balance to the room. This is extraordinary. Constance folded her hands. No, extraordinary was generations of women disappearing politely while everyone called it honorable. Charles turned back. This family will pay heavily for your decision. Constance regarded him quietly. This family will continue exactly as before. Our daughters will simply participate in it as people rather than furniture. The word landed hard. Furniture? Useful. Maintained. Owned. Edward closed his eyes briefly. Helena began crying very softly. No one comforted her because no one understood yet whether the grief belonged to Vera or to herself. Charles remained standing near the windows, breathing carefully through anger. You betray everything this family built. Constance looked around the room slowly. The portraits, the polished silver, the careful manners preserving harm beneath elegance for generations. Then she answered with absolute calm. No, I refuse to continue the part that required sacrificing women to maintain it. The meeting ended without resolution. How could it not? Systems that old did not collapse neatly in single afternoons. No collective enlightenment arrived. No speeches transformed everyone completely. Charles left furious beneath restraint. Edmund left calculating consequences. Helena left haunted. Edward lingered longest. He stood beside the fireplace while Constance gathered papers slowly back into her bag. Finally, he said quietly, You've been planning this a very long time. Constance fastened the clasp. Since Vera told me about the teaching, Edward stared at her. That was 2 years ago. Yes, rain began at last against the windows, soft at first. Edward sank slowly into a chair. For the first time in his life, perhaps, he looked genuinely old. I didn't know, he said after a long silence, about the teaching. Constance paused. No, she answered softly. None of us did. That was rather the point. Edward looked down at his hands that had inherited comfort without ever examining its construction. Hands that had loved his wife sincerely while failing to recognize what surrounded her daughters. I don't know what to do with this now, he admitted. Constance studied him carefully, and because she loved him despite everything, because 45 years created complexities larger than judgment alone, she crossed the room and touched his shoulder lightly. You begin by understanding that not knowing was never innocence. Edward covered her hand briefly with his own. Not redemption, not transformation, only the first painful crack in certainty. Sometimes that was all history allowed. They drove home through steady rain. Fields blurred silver beyond the car windows. Edward drove slower than usual. His knuckles rested pale against the steering wheel. Neither spoke for miles. At last, Edward said quietly, almost to himself, Vera would have been good with children. Constance turned toward the rain-streaked glass before he could see her expression. Yes, she said, I think she would have. Nothing more, but something had shifted. Small, incomplete, real, and sometimes real change entered the world not as triumph, but as one old man finally grieving a life he had never before understood was stolen. 6 months later, autumn settled gently over the Whitmore estate. The garden softened into bronze and faded gold. Roses bloomed less extravagantly now, but deeper somehow, their final blossoms carrying the concentrated sweetness of things nearing rest. Mornings arrived cool enough for coats. Smoke drifted occasionally from neighboring chimneys beyond the trees. From Rose's perspective, life had become pleasantly ordinary. Uncle Charles attended fewer family gatherings. When present, he remained courteous but oddly distant, his former attentive warmth redirected elsewhere without explanation. Rose noticed the change vaguely, then dismissed it. Families shifted constantly around invisible tensions. She had grown up understanding that much. Something had settled above her head recently. A decision, perhaps. An argument concluded in rooms where older relatives spoke carefully behind closed doors. Whatever it was, the atmosphere around her felt lighter now. She could not have explained why. Thomas visited often. He fit nowhere within Whitmore society and everywhere within Rose's actual life. They walked long paths through town discussing books and students and weather. He listened when she spoke and never rushed the spaces between her thoughts. One October afternoon, they wandered beside the river while leaves drifted copper-colored across the water. Thomas seemed unusually nervous. Rose noticed immediately, though she pretended not to for several minutes out of kindness. Finally, he stopped walking. Rose. She turned. His hands disappeared into his coat pockets, then emerged again. "I'd like to ask your mother's blessing." A small pause. "Before I ask you." Rose looked at him quietly. The river moved behind them, silver beneath cloudlight. Is that," he smiled awkwardly, "old-fashioned?" "Probably." "No." Rose's own smile appeared slowly. "It's thoughtful." Relief crossed his face. "You think she'd mind?" Rose shook her head gently. "She'll say yes." Thomas laughed once softly. "You sound very certain." Rose resumed walking. "I am." "How?" She considered the question. "Because my mother has been standing between me and something invisible my entire life." But Rose knew none of that consciously. What she knew instead was simpler. "My mother has very good judgment about important things." Thomas visited the following Sunday. Constance received him in the garden despite the cold because she preferred difficult conversations among living things. The roses had nearly finished blooming. Fallen petals spotted the pathways dark red against wet stone. Thomas stood beside the pergola, visibly trying to appear composed. Constance almost pitied him. Almost. "You've come to ask permission," she said before he could begin. He blinked. Was it that obvious? To anyone over 40, yes. His nervous laugh warmed the chilly air briefly. Constance studied him while he struggled for the correct formal phrasing. Ordinary young man, earnest eyes, hands roughened slightly from repairing shelves in his classroom himself, because schools never had enough funding for proper maintenance anymore. No Whitmore polish. Thank God again. "I love her very much," he said finally. "I know perhaps I don't offer what your family expected for her life, but—" Constance interrupted gently. "What do you think my family expected for her life?" Thomas stopped. Rainwater dripped softly from bare branches nearby. "I don't know exactly," he admitted. "Something narrower, perhaps." Constance looked at him steadily. "Good." He saw more than she had realized. "Thomas." Her voice softened. "Rose has spent 24 years becoming herself very quietly. Do not ask her to become smaller for your comfort simply because the world overlooked her while she did it." He met her gaze directly. "I wouldn't." "I know." That surprised him. Constance smiled then. Small. Real. "You have my blessing." Relief flooded his face so openly she nearly laughed. He thanked her with heartfelt sincerity. And as she watched him walk back toward the house afterward, Constance felt something release inside her chest that she had been carrying for years without fully recognizing its weight. Not triumph. Never triumph. Only relief. The engagement announcement occurred 2 weeks later during a family dinner. Rose sat flushed and smiling beside Thomas while congratulations circled the table in measured, elegant waves. Champagne glimmered pale gold beneath chandelier light. Diana cried immediately and denied it afterward. Michael kissed Rose's forehead warmly. Charles attended. Of course he did. Whitmore discipline required appearances maintained even after defeat. He shook Thomas's hand courteously, offered proper congratulations, inquired after wedding dates with impeccable civility. Performance. But performance mattered in families like this. Civilization often survived through rituals people continued enacting after belief weakened. Helena watched Rose throughout the evening with an expression Constance understood intimately. Grief tangled inseparably with relief. Rose laughed at something Thomas whispered midway through dinner, and her entire face transformed with it. Open, present, fully alive in the moment without caution or carefulness. Constance felt Vera's absence sharply then, not as ghostly haunting. As contrast, this was what had been prevented before. This lightness, this unguarded unfolding of selfhood. Diana appeared quietly beside her mother near the terrace doors later, while the others lingered over dessert. "You did it," Diana whispered. Constance looked across the room toward Rose. Thomas was speaking with animated nervousness to Edmund about school funding while Rose watched him with unmistakable affection. "No," Constance said softly. "She did it." Diana frowned slightly. "How?" Constance smiled faintly. "By becoming herself before they could decide otherwise." Outside, beyond the glass autumn rain, drifted silver through the garden. Diana leaned against the doorway. "Is that really enough? One person refusing?" Constance thought of Vera, Margaret, unnamed women vanishing backward through generations. Then she thought of Rose standing laughing beneath chandelier light with an ordinary schoolteacher beside her and an unknowable future opening naturally ahead. "No," she said honestly, "it isn't enough." Diana looked at her, "But it is something." Later that evening, after guests departed, Rose hugged her mother tightly in the front hall. "Thank you," she murmured. Constance held her close, briefly breathing in traces of rain and perfume and youth. "For what?" Rose smiled. "For seeing him properly." Constance closed her eyes a moment. "If only you knew," she thought. Then immediately corrected herself. "No, better that you never do." "The best protection," Constance said quietly while smoothing Rose's hair once, "is the kind that leaves no scar to explain." Rose looked mildly puzzled. Constance kissed her forehead lightly before explanation became necessary. Some truths existed only to burden those already free of them. Rose married Thomas on a Saturday in late spring, beneath skies so perfectly clear they appeared arranged. Perhaps they were. Constance had planned the garden carefully for months. White roses opened along the stone walls precisely on schedule. Lavender swayed blue-purple beneath warm wind. Bees drifted lazily through foxgloves near the fountain. Guests gathered across the lawn in pale linen and summer hats, while musicians played softly near the terrace. And through the open windows of the garden room, Vera's portrait watched quietly from its new place above the mantel. No one questioned the move. Portraits shifted occasionally in old houses. Decorations evolved. Only Constance understood the significance fully. Vera belonged among living things now, not trapped forever halfway up a staircase watching generations pass. Rose crossed the garden toward Thomas with sunlight caught in her dark hair. No hesitation in her step, no invisible architecture narrowing around her future. simply a woman walking toward the life she had chosen herself. Constance sat beside Edward during the ceremony. At one point, his hand found hers unexpectedly. Not apology, not absolution, only recognition perhaps of what nearly had not happened here today. When Rose laughed during her vows, several guests smiled affectionately. Constance felt tears gather suddenly without warning. Not from sadness exactly, from contrast again. Vera had laughed softly too once, probably, before carefulness replaced spontaneity entirely. After the ceremony, Rose danced barefoot briefly on the grass because the shoes pinched. Thomas watched her with helpless affection. Children chased each other between tables. Diana drank too much champagne and blamed Michael afterward. Life unfolded. Ordinary. Miraculous precisely because it was ordinary. Years passed gently after that. Rose and Thomas moved into a modest stone house near the school where Thomas taught. Rose worked part-time at the local library before eventually having children. 2 daughters first, then a son years later, unexpected and adored. None of them knew any road had once been waiting invisibly beneath their mother's feet. None of them knew a system older than memory had almost folded shut around her life before she even recognized its shape. That ignorance itself became Constance's greatest accomplishment. The arrangement did not vanish entirely from the wider Whitmore family. Constance had never possessed that power. Other branches continued quietly preserving old expectations beneath new language. Some traditions survived because enough people still feared the instability of freedom more than the cost of control. Charles never forgave her fully, though age softened his certainty eventually into weary distance. Edmund adapted pragmatically once financial disaster failed to materialize. Systems often appeared eternal until someone interrupted them successfully. Then suddenly they became merely habits. Helena changed most painfully. 3 years after Rose's wedding, Constance visited her one rainy afternoon in Kent. The house smelled faintly of dust and lilies. Helena moved slower now. Her hands shook noticeably pouring tea. They sat together near the windows while weather blurred the garden beyond. For a long time, neither mentioned Vera. Then Helena spoke abruptly. "Do you think she would have been happy?" Constance looked up. "If things had been different," Helena whispered. Rain moved softly against glass. Constance considered carefully before answering, because some questions deserved honesty more than comfort. "I think she would have become exactly what she was meant to become." Helena closed her eyes briefly. "And we don't know what that was." "No." The grief inside the room deepened quietly then. Not dramatic. Irreversible. Helena stared down at her hands. "I should have asked her," she said finally. Constance felt the familiar ache return sharp as ever after all these years. "Yes," she answered softly, "we both should have." Silence settled between them. Then Constance added, "That is the lesson, I think, not only for Vera." Helena looked toward her slowly. For everyone sitting quietly in some room somewhere waiting to be told who they are allowed to become. Helena began crying without sound. Constance reached across the space between them and covered her hand gently. Too late for Vera. That remained true, no matter how tenderly they mourned her afterward. Too late mattered. The story refused to pretend otherwise. Constance grew older the way gardens did, gradually, gracefully where possible, painfully where unavoidable. At 78, she moved slower along the pathways each morning. Her knees protested damp weather. She required reading glasses now for seed catalogs. The roses demanded more work than they once had. Still, she tended them herself. Early mornings remained her sanctuary. The house quieter these days. Edward sleeping later. Many bedrooms empty except during holidays when grandchildren flooded corridors with noise and muddy shoes and impossible questions. One little girl especially followed Constance everywhere. Rose's youngest daughter, Clara, 8 years old. Serious eyes. Endless curiosity. "What are these called again?" Clara asked one June morning, pointing toward pale climbing blooms. "Madame Alfred Carrière." "That's too long." Constance laughed softly. "Most beautiful things survive difficult names." Clara considered this gravely while trailing fingers through lavender. From the kitchen doorway, Rose watched them both. 40 now, nearly. Lines beginning gently around her eyes. Entirely herself still. Unhurried. Present. Free in ways so complete she never once recognized them as freedom. Constance preferred it that way. Vera's portrait stood now permanently on Constance's bedside table. Every morning it became the first face she saw. Every night the last. She never stopped pausing for it. Never would. Because memory mattered even when justice remained impossible. Especially then. One evening near dusk, Constance sat alone in the garden while the air cooled around blooming roses. The house behind her glowed softly gold through open windows. Somewhere inside, Clara laughed at something Edward said. Constance closed her eyes briefly. There were women in every family whose names survived only in obituary programs and fading photographs tucked into drawers. Women who wanted ordinary, beautiful things. To teach, to travel, to paint, to live alone beside the sea. To marry unsuitable men, to have children, not have children, to wake each morning inside lives chosen consciously rather than assigned quietly by people claiming to know better. Some of those women never even learned the shape of their own wanting before duty sealed over it permanently. Vera had not received justice. No speech repaired her life. No revelation returned the classroom she should have stood inside while children waited with notebooks open and sunlight crossed chalkboards behind her. Constance had failed Vera too for many years. That truth remained. Love arriving late did not erase lateness. It only altered what happened next. A breeze moved through the garden, carrying the dense sweetness of roses toward her chair. Inside the house, Rose's voice drifted faintly through open windows, answering one of the children. Warm, alive, entirely her own. Constance opened her eyes. She could not reach backward through generations, handing freedom to women already buried. She could only interrupt the future, one daughter at a time if necessary. One refusal, one document, one quiet act of protection so complete the protected person never even realized danger had existed. That cost something real. Marriage strain. Family fracture. 45 years of earned acceptance surrendered gradually. Constance paid every part willingly. Because this was what love became when it finally paid attention. Not performance. Not sacrifice praised publicly over polished tables. Refusal, quiet, complete, final. The kind that expected no gratitude afterward. The kind that simply changed the shape of the road ahead and then returned to tending roses as though nothing extraordinary had occurred at all. Clara ran suddenly across the grass toward her, waving a flower triumphantly. "Gran, look what opened!" Constance smiled and reached for the bloom. Behind the child, the evening light settled softly across the garden where Rose stood, watching them both from the doorway of the house. Present, unassigned, free. And somewhere inside that freedom, though Rose would never know it, Vera's lost life remained honored at last. Not repaired, never repaired, but remembered properly, which was the beginning of every honest ending. If Vera's story and Rose's story found you today, share this with someone who deserves to be asked what they actually want before it's too late to ask.